yourself approach. So the form of this was really meant to be kind of just a presentation of like a framing, and then folks were going to talk about what they're doing, but in general, I think if it's encouraging dialogue, encouraging folks to ask questions and interrupt or maybe not interrupt, but engage is probably the way. Maybe what we should do is just sort of introduce ourselves, and then we'll just talk. Do you want to go first?
Sure. Hello. Well, hi everybody. Good morning. My name is Martina. I work with the U.S. Federation of Worker Cooperatives. I'm the membership director. I also been involved with movements of independent media since I was in Mexico, organizing with indie media, community radio stuff. I'm working in some other installations with cell phone autonomous networks in Mexico and South Mexico. So a little bit of like a techie, and also working with worker cooperatives.
And I'm Dave Hammer. I'm the executive director of the ICA Group. We're a national consulting company that focuses on democratic workplaces and worker-oriented social enterprise. And we do a lot of work in partnership with labor, hence my presence here today.
Hey, I'm Caitlin Pearce. I work at Freelancers Union. I'm the director of advocacy and member engagement. And Freelancers Union is a national labor organization. We represent 360,000 freelancers across the U.S. And that's really kind of a wide variety of workers in different professional industries, contractors, self-employed, temps, and so forth.
And I'm Fredrik Söderqvist. I'm an economist at Unionen, which is a white-collar private sector trade union from Sweden. We're also the largest trade union in Sweden, and we represent about 640,000 members. 10,000 of those are self-employed in a specific self-employed membership, very similar to the Freelancers Union. I'm going to talk a little bit about why Sweden is so weird, and maybe some things we could, some lessons from that.
So apparently I was looking the other way when it was decided who's going to go first. So I was selected to go first. So I want to talk a little bit about the ICA Group and our work, but also with in our history. I think it actually kind of positions us to have what I think is sort of the way I think about this work and the broader context of this work, and both the sort of opportunities and limitations of it. So just to sort of talk a little bit about ICA and what we do and the connection to labor unions and to the labor movement writ large. We are a consulting company for democratic workplaces. So, in the shortest version, what we do is we are essentially a translation service between social justice and business, right? So we work with folks who are trying to build businesses that try to change the world, and we say, here's like the mechanisms to make sure that those businesses are successful businesses, right? So people talk about like, what is the biggest challenge facing worker co-ops and social enterprise? And it's capital and it's all of these things. It's not, it's strategy, it's business models, right? There is money for good businesses. There is support for good businesses. We need to have the amount of revenue that we bring in needs to exceed the amount of expenses that we have consistently for a long period of time. That is like the solution to businesses, and that's what we help folks do, right? How we work with labor, and I think kind of the context for some of this stuff around like the platform cooperative movement and the labor movement and the cooperative movement and all of these things. So ICA has been around for 40 years, which means in the sort of this very little world that we operate in the US, we are kind of the conventional wisdom, which gives us a nice sort of viewpoint of like, we can sort of see what has been done and say, hey, like we did, folks tried that in 1987, folks tried that in 1983, folks tried that in 2004 and 1996. and we can translate that stuff. It also makes us a little more, because we're so focused on sort of like the business realities, right? Like it makes us a little bit probably more conservative than we should be. So we look at groups like platform. This is a really exciting sort of audacious group of folks, and it's like, well, what's the practical reality? Like, how do we make it work? How do we be, like make it work? And we're not so. That's sort of, you need that. So we're sort of the critical voice, I think, in some ways in this space. But from the sort of the viewpoint of sort of the long view of this work, organizationally, the reality is that I think co-ops, worker-centered businesses, trade unions, immigrant organizing, sort of social justice work that focuses on workers is all part of this broader labor movement. And that one of the things I like about the sort of the lens of platform cooperativism is it's a mechanism that says, hey, let's bring all these folks together and think about this in a different way. And I think that's some of the stuff that we can do. Because people talk about like, oh, unions should be interested in employee ownership. And the ISA group, our first union buyout of a co-op, of a business into a co-op was in 1977. So it's like they're interested, right? Like this is not a new thing. They move in and out of being interested. But I think right now, which is kind of exciting but also a little scary, is that right now there's a moment in time where labor is really, really weak in the US and are looking to new models of organizing, new models of engagement, and are open to this notion of democracy, open to this notion of ownership. And I think the sort of technological changes that are going on say like, here, there are new ways to think about ownership, there are new ways to think about connectivity. And so for me, it's really exciting to sort of see this, these things come together. Just, very briefly, in terms of just give sort of a broad picture of the landscape, we are right now working with a number of different unions, and I don't know if you'd call these platform cooperatives or if you'd call them worker cooperatives or if you'd call them purchasing cooperatives. You'd probably call them all three of those things depending on sort of where you came from. But we're working with a lot of different labor unions. So in the city right now, we're working with the Transport Workers Union, which is the union that represents the MTA workers, on figuring out how to do employee ownership in the school bus industry. And so this is an area where the union looks and says, like, the for-profit entities are systematically underinvesting in, like New York City is where school buses go to die, right? That's like quite literally, right? The average age of a school bus in New York City is like 35 years old. And so, why is it that, kids in the city should be on these, rickety old, nasty old buses? Let's figure out a worker co-op solution to that. We're also working with SEIU in a lot of different places, but in particular, one of the things I want to talk about is our work with them in the childcare space, where a lot of recent Supreme Court decisions have made it very difficult to collect dues from workers. And say what you want about dues, but the labor movement is a social justice organization with a business model, and that means that they have money to do stuff, and we should, embrace that. And so a lot of that work is really about aggregating individual workers, family childcare, in this case, family childcare providers, folks who run childcare centers out of their home, and getting these folks work together in a networked way. And so that is both like sort of there's a social connectivity in that, so it's very highly localized in terms of neighborhoods, but it's got this technology component where if we want to solve sort of a lot of the back office and engaging with the state and the city in terms of payment systems, you need a refined and sophisticated technology platform. So it's this sort of really wonderful intersection of that. And I can, talk about it a little bit more, but I'll turn it over to, I'm not sure.
No, I mean, I can go. So, I mean, the question that I was asked to answer in this panel was who should own these platforms, right? And I think, you know, when I hear the question, you know, other questions really come to my mind, you know, like, well, you know, for instance, you know, what is the purpose for you to create these platforms? You know, who you're trying to organize with? You know, what kind of industries you're trying to serve? You know, who are the workers? They are, you know, mostly participating in those industries, and yeah, and where's your demographics, right? Like sort of like how you start looking at, you know, like marketing studies. You know, it's like thinking a little bit like that, and then. So we work with worker owners. We are a membership organization. We have in our membership something like 160 members. 100 probably of them are democratic workplaces and worker cooperatives. So we are in the phone every week with them talking about their challenges as worker cooperatives, the challenges of workers to really transition from the concept of being an employee to become an owner, right? So we always, when we try to think about worker cooperatives and democratic workplaces, we have these you know, different levels of ownership and democracy, right? And sometimes some of these workplaces are closer to ownership, and sometimes they're closer to be democratic, and sometimes, you know, they're in the really sweet spot where both of those are elements. They are, you know, part of the workplace, but it is really a big challenge for these folks, right? When they come to us, we offer some technical assistance. We offer also some advice, and we do a lot of referrals. We do refer to the IC group pretty often when it comes to, you know, governance and figuring, you know, sometimes their financial structure. But a lot of the challenges that we hear is on the culture of cooperatives, right? And how actually you know, these workers can actually become more proactive in their workplaces, how to actually take on that leadership, right? The logic of you're actually in charge of your business and you're not just receiving orders, right? So these cooperatives have been facing these challenges for, you know, many years, and they have a lot to offer in their experience of, you know, what they have learned. So we also are trying to work with them and encourage peer advisory. So to pair sometimes some cooperatives, you know, they have succeeded in some specific model with some other cooperatives. They are new, they are startups, they are, you know, facing some of these challenges, or sometimes try to, you know, to just encourage a conversation among same industries. So that's you know, when I hear, you know, about platform cooperativism, it's actually something that is really interesting to me. As I was mentioning before, I've been involved in, you know, some, you know, projects with technology and autonomy in Mexico and the United States. So I think when I hear this question, you know, to my mind, you know, it comes a lot of things around, you know, how you're really trying to organize these platforms. Because to me, you know, a platform, an online platform, you know, and the way and how I see it, you know, and how I've been working with some different movements, you know, a platform, an online platform is a tool, right? And you can give different purposes and functions to that tool. So, for instance, you know, I was thinking in different models of platforms that I have, you know, hear about it. And some of them, you know, are doing the work of really trying to capture that gig economy, right? Like those individuals, they don't have a job, you know, they're really desperate to try to find any kind of income, right? And trying to capture them is probably a reason of, you know, capturing the profit that is somewhere there, you know, and that is like big companies are trying to capture, right? But like when we put the word of a cooperative, you know, to me, then it makes me think, you know, like, well, then you're probably trying to organize these workers in a different way, right? Probably to try to, you know, defend, you know, the rights, you know, the benefits that all these workers are losing in this gig economy. So then it means, that what you're trying to do is going to take a lot of work, right? Because then you're going to probably have to face the same challenges the worker cooperatives are already facing, right? So that's one thing, And then there is platforms. I was talking with Maru Bautista, who's from Center Family Life, who developed the app Up and Go. And I was trying to understand how the platform works in terms of the structure and the governance and what technically the platform is doing, And in my conversation with her, I think what I told you, is like, oh, it seems like this is similar to what we call the marketing and referral, a little bit, where the members of the platform are cooperatives, existing cooperatives, cleaning cooperatives, that they have their own governance and structure already. They become members of the platform, and then they also participate on the decisions of what's happening with the platform, and the platform itself was developed with the input of these platforms, right? So in that way, you're engaging in a dynamic of work with these existing cooperatives, but you don't have to run from zero a whole structure. Like these cooperatives are already doing what they need to do. In that way, I thought, differently from platforms like Handy, where you don't really have any kind of a structure or anything. You just go and grab the worker and take their their work and make profit out of it, and then you're not really trying to organize anything around it. It's a really interesting model because you're already engaging with an existing structure. So that was really interesting. Then I was thinking it is interesting that they are not going all the way in the technical way to just connect with the individual. Just to be fast, to be more functional, to be efficient with technology, But then I was thinking, what? I really, really like the way and how this technology is being used in a really smart way when we are not leaving, anybody behind, right? These worker cooperatives already are employing workers, there are already people that had a place for these jobs. And in that way, it's a really smart way to combine technology with organizing, and for that you need a human being, right? So I really think that when we are thinking in this platform, it's important, that we're also thinking in how we're engaging with existing movements and workplaces, and we're not trying to actually, replace, jobs. Because to me, the reason why we are in this movement as, worker owners is because we're really trying to create better jobs, better benefits, right? The ownership and democratic aspect of that, it means that to us, right? So I think, also when I think in unions, it does make sense, since there are specific, moments where, challenges, for instance, that the unions are facing in this country. And there were specific challenges. We were just in a conference of home care cooperatives, the home care industry, for instance. You have already independent providers that the union is trying to figure out a way and how to bring them together under an umbrella to be able to organize them, right? So an online platform and a cooperative, it really makes sense because you really are using the platform to organize those workers and to be able to defend them and to be able to negotiate, right? Better wages, benefits probably. So I think that in that way, to me, it was in the way, it makes sense that the unions are involved in that ownership, right? Then I also think in the challenges of many of the workers that we represent in those unions, right? We work with a lot of immigrant workers, a lot of folks that can be represented because their immigration status, right? And for those workers, I think it just really makes sense that those workers are the ones that own those platforms, because those are the ones that can have access to benefits, they can have access to security, and, they are the more vulnerable from a lot of the workers that we work with, So I do really think in all these questions, and I think that the best thing for these platforms, you're really trying to think in something that it will be different, from what we already have in Silicon Valley and all that, It's first of all, trying to be movements, all platforms, all developers, they are talking with the people that needs these services, which means, being diverse, which means, being inclusive, which means trying to create alliances that can bring the knowledge that not necessarily, the techie world has, right? And I'm talking about that from experience, right? Like where we are pushing ourselves to actually work with the people, work with communities, in Mexico, for instance, like we were working with indigenous communities to try to understand what were the needs and what was the kind of technology that they need there, right? So to me, in order for this to be really something that is different from what we already have, you really need to engage with those challenges, right? And I'm actually really glad to see, that it's this group is probably the same people that I will see in some other conference. They're like techie. So I'm really glad to see women, for instance, in this room. I'm really, really glad. And yeah, I think that those are the challenges, but definitely I think alliances is what I think when it comes to mind when, I hear this question about who should be owning these platforms. I'm gonna leave it there. Pass the microphone.
Sure. Hey, so again, I'm Caitlin from Freelancers Union, and I think I'll just talk a little bit about the Freelancers Union model and how I think it kind of relates to the larger conversation. So, as a labor organization, Freelancers Union is fairly unique. We're not, similar to traditional union. We don't do collective bargaining. Our membership is free. We have 360,000 members nationwide. And, our project has really been about how can we build different types of empowering platforms for freelance workers. And, we found that 1/3 of the US workforce is doing some type of freelance work. And that could be on top of full-time employment, that could be part-time, or that could be sort of their full-time work. And, in terms of our membership, it's, again, a broad range of industries, ways of working. I think what really cuts across are some common needs. Freelancers are all, generally working 5 to 7 gigs every month. They really put a premium on being able to put together diverse income streams. They have a constant need to find new gigs. They're dealing with unpredictable income, potentially not getting paid on time from clients or in full. And they're struggling to really manage a lot of the back end of that work. So they have complicated finances and they completely lack, the traditional safety net that employees have. And so, where we've really organized the focus of our work is around how can we create an institution that builds sort of a long-term set of empowering platforms for these workers while still allowing them the flexibility to move from job to job and gig to gig. And we've done that in a few different ways. So one of the first ways, which I think sort of is close to, but not exactly the same as a cooperative principle, is around sort of our ability to build power in markets for freelancers when accessing benefits. And so we have grouped together workers. We've given them access to, in different ways, to healthcare, to different types of supports that they need, income smoothing tools, and so forth. And then the other way is really around building a community based in solidarity and cooperation. And so, right now we have this interesting model that we're just starting to grow and develop, where we have organizers of freelance workers who are in 23 cities across the country now and are coming together as hubs to access training, to build community, to build networks for job referrals. And we're really seeing that as a union, as a model on which we can grow and build sort of what we see as mutualism. But we talk about it in different ways with our membership. But it's also a way to build more meaningful worker leadership and ways that the union can be worker driven in the types of supports it's offering. And then finally, we really work to change the laws and advocate to change the playing field. So in the past year, we passed a law protecting freelancers from non-payment in New York City. This was sort of a first of its kind piece of legislation, and it's a way that we are working to level the playing field to help provide freelancers with more of a safety net and a set of protections where one doesn't exist. And I think that, when I think of some of the considerations of the things that we've done in terms of being able to give access to more affordable insurance and benefits, access to training, access to a lot of things that are all sort of empowering things for freelancers, I think that, our models are all benefiting by scale, but they're not requiring that they be a certain share of the market. So we've been able to sort of grow these incrementally over time by collaborating with our membership. And they've really focused on, social safety net and training. They've not been as focused on aggregating workers around a particular workplace or platform simply because that's not how our members are working. And so, as I approach this conversation, I'm really eager to hear from some of the other models that are being built and where we can be expanding on this work in a way that really works for our membership. I'll leave it at that so we can kind of jump in a conversation.
Well, thanks, Caitlin. We are living in really, for trade unions, very interesting times, but also very scary times, I'd say. I know that as I live in Sweden, and like most of the world, we follow all debates going on in the United States, because you are the country we've been looking up to for the past 100 years or so. But we do, like, the challenges facing trade unions look very different from very different countries. And from a country with 70% union density and 90% collective bargaining coverage, it looks very, very different in dealing with the challenges that the platform economy is facing, or like maybe the last, hopefully, bad incarnation of the neoliberal consensus that's been going on for the past 40 years. But why is Sweden so weird, or I should say the Nordic countries? Because we developed our labor market models in unison in the beginning of the 20th century. But we looked at the United States and the United Kingdom a lot when we were building our union movements. And what happened early on was a debate that's going on in the United States right now, which is the right to work legislation. We lost that battle in 1909, and we haven't dealt with it since. Now, that was a huge loss then, I assume. No one's really around to talk about it anymore. But what happened was that our model developed from going to legislators forcing unions onto companies, but instead legislators supporting a dialogue structure. But what's so weird about this model is that it actually started with the employers having a really weird idea that differed compared to the United States a lot. There's a really good book by Peter Swenson, I think, of MIT from 2002 that looks at the different labor market regions and they developed. But what the employers in Sweden looked to do was actually to contain trade unions through collective bargaining. They saw that if we can push the unions into the contracts, we can stiff them much more efficiently because they were weak. And they would get stronger by centralizing their organizations. So the employers, they would say, we have standardized agreement, and some things that they would not allow to go through is union shops. So that's one of the major things that they push. They have the right to hire and fire whoever they please. Now, as time moved on and universal suffrage came to Sweden, the employers, so they would regulate through contracts. Universal suffrage would mean that we would no longer have right-wing governments. We would have social democratic, not majority, but close to it for the foreseeable future. That provided an initial incentive for the employers to say, we want to regulate this through the contracts instead. And what happened in the 30s, and I think it was in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, various institutions were set up that through the back door supported unions. So for instance, we set up a Ghent-style system of unemployment insurance, which said that you had to be a union member to get unemployment insurance. So union density would rise through this more incentivized mechanism instead of being forced in, which is kind of grandfathered in, I think is the correct word, which the New Deal or Labor Relations Act did. And the reason I bring this up is I know that there's a discussion of a better deal. So after the Trump administration, if Democrats get a majority, they will start to look at what will labor relations in the United States look like in the future. And if you look at it's been really fun to work at a trade union as an economist for the past 4.5 years, is that the IMF and the OECD, who normally give us trade unions in the Nordics a very hard time because we are not liberalizing our labor markets enough, they're actually changed their minds entirely. And this is the income inequality debate, of course, that comes in. And what they are seeing is that our self-regulated institutions, where legislators look to the social partners to solve a lot of the problems, not just wage bargaining, making sure that our members get wage increases every year, but also making sure that retraining and reskilling when you're laid off because of globalization or technical change, those systems we are highly participated in. And we have our own model, we have our own private unemployment offices, for instance, that work much better than the public ones. So this model for over the past 100 years has slowly evolved into a market economy. It's a very capitalistic market economy, but it's highly co-determined at the same time. So what happened is we have all these very highly developed institutions that put us in a much better position to deal with robots taking over a lot of jobs, but also the platforms in essence. Because we see the platforms as, it could be a great opportunity. I mean, for us, a platform is a way to automize the boss. An algorithm could essentially lead and direct and coordinate your work in the future. And perhaps they could do it more efficiently, follow the rules a lot more better than a human being could. Because, I mean, unions exist because we have to follow someone's orders in order to get stuff done. That could be good, but if we have a say in how it's done, perhaps we could do it better and with less arguments. But there will always be arguments, of course. Otherwise, I wouldn't have a job. But practically, what do we do then? What should we practically do? So one thing that we are looking in Sweden at doing is, well, if we want the platforms to follow our rules, which are the sectoral collective agreements that we have, we want the platforms to be integrated into existing sectoral agreements. That means that they follow the same rules as all the other employers. In the United States, you don't have sectoral bargaining. And I was a bit disappointed when I looked to the Better Deal proposal that came, that sectoral bargaining, I don't think, was on there. Why not? Why don't you aim big? You have a lot of big problems, you should aim higher. But what we see is these agreements they're legal texts. And who makes the platforms? Engineers and programmers. I don't think they are labor law experts, especially not collective agreement labor law experts. Those 5 people, I know all of them, and they are not programmers in Sweden. So what we're thinking of doing, and what we're starting to do a little bit, not with co-op firms, unfortunately, so far, but looking at how can we make it easier for you to build your platform to follow the rules more efficiently. What kind of features can you build into the platform to follow a rule that would normally be a much more manual or picking up a phone or writing an email? How can you automate some of the functions of following the rules? So that's one thing we're looking at. But what I find really interesting about the co-op movement in the United States, where you obviously do not have these circumstances from the beginning, I think we have, that we know of, 3 agreements with platform companies. And they came to us, essentially saying, which agreement should we be under? I mean, that's how weird it is, but that's a fact. It kind of sells itself. Well, not really, I should say. In some sectors, it's really hard to push it on there, especially when they are very influenced by Silicon Valley. That's when it gets, we're doing something totally different. It's like, no, you're just doing the American thing. It doesn't work here. But what we see with the co-op movement, I mean, in essence, it's a practical way of getting a living wage, good working conditions, and good insurances and pensions and all of that. So what I would like to see is practically moving the co-op movement forward. It actually start thinking big about which institutions can we build to make it more practical and easy to attach yourself to existing systems that have economies of scale, that have a collective bargaining force towards insurance companies and buying insurances and so on. Maybe it start exploring sectoral bargaining for platforms as well, because making company agreements on every platform, that's going to be a lot of work practically. It's going to be a lot of work for the unions to do that. Set up a standard, a minimum level that all the co-ops do. I mean, these are some thoughts, and this is from the Swedish perspective, but this perspective, the systems are designed together with employers, and they want it as easy as possible. We want the rules to be good, they want them to be as easy as possible, and not too expensive, of course. That's always, that's one topic we will never agree on. But I mean, these are the Swedish thoughts about this. You have an opportunity now to think big about which institutions you want in the future. The co-op movement is a great place to start because you have the willingness to build systems that are fair. And what we would like to talk more about is how can we make these systems practical and scalable.
I mean, I was just thinking, that I actually would like to give you like a quick overview of like what is the worker cooperative movement in the United States right now. Like actually I prepared some slides, but I don't have the power of this thing, so I'm just gonna read it. We actually conduct an annual economic survey to worker cooperatives and democratic workplaces, and we have the analysis of the results that we got from last year. So we survey 323. We tried to survey 323 workplaces. Probably something like 110 responded. So our results are based on that. From what we got, they're hiring something like 6,033 workers and produce about 395 million in revenue each year. I'm just going to read some interesting, things that came up about stability and retention. The worker cooperatives increase access to full-time work for industries that typically have, short schedule, like part-time. In terms of, compensation practices and benefits, the average wage was 16.54 per hour. And each worker, an average of 31 hours per week. In terms of the benefits, just 29% are offering employee health care plans and 25% are offering any form of traditional retirement plans, So that's something that we're still trying to build. So with the Federation, we're trying to figure out also how we can, create healthcare plans. We can't really build something, that is a national, because there is specific, circumstances state by state. But we are able to build some other health-related benefits like vision and dental benefits. The retirement plan is something that we're still trying to build. And something about the demographics of these worker cooperatives. Almost 70% of all employees are female. About 60% are non-white, and Latinos are the largest plurality of any race with 43%. And in terms of the industries, where the concentration of these worker cooperatives at the sectors include retail, trade, house cleaning cooperatives, landscaping firms, manufacturing like coffee, food, printing business, professional services like the tech industry firms, and healthcare with home care agencies and health clinics. So that was just, to me that's like something interesting, because like that's where we have been seeing like grow in the industries, So that's what I was mentioning, home care, because to me, like once again, like thinking in platform cooperatives, and what's really the industries where people is going, is something that I think we really need to pay attention when we are trying to think where we're trying to build, And another thing that I found interesting is when I was doing another presentation on platform cooperatives and I was looking, for instance, some, analysis on what Uber is doing or has been doing, I think 2 years ago. It was interesting to me to see that, for instance, more women, more female are drivers of Uber versus taxis, and also more white, non-Latinos are drivers in Uber, which might be changing right now, but just to think, like the industries here in the United States of taxi drivers, it was, pretty, large, formed by, all like members were immigrants. So that's, once again, to me, like something to pay attention, like who are like the people that will be using these platforms as workers. And then that's, what it makes me think, that's the people that we need to organize with, and then, you're an expert in, analysis of markets, where are those industries, that we need to pay attention to.
I mean, one other thing I'd want to pick up on from that comment is sort of, something David was saying about, social justice with a business model, which I think is really important at a time when we're looking at traditional unions really having their revenue streams completely threatened and undermined, and that being sort of something that we could say is a soon to become catastrophe for the union movement. And picking up on the idea of sort of, at Freelancers Union, we have this ecosystem with which we have revenue generation that's fueling other advocacy work. And I'm really curious, and for us that's really been policy advocacy. But I'm really curious to also explore how that could be, sort of what are the structures in which that could be, collective bargaining could be integrated into that type of a labor employment exchange through cooperative systems.
I mean, so one of the things that's interesting about some of the work that some unions, not all unions, are doing in this sphere is they look and say the collective bargaining model has not been particularly effective. So especially for non-traditional workforce. So this is like absolutely the case in childcare, where it's like the ability to organize workers is incredibly difficult through traditional sort of national labor relations means. So they've approached it in different ways through legislative approaches. But even then, the challenges of collective bargaining are enormous, and they don't, they're making some inroads and some pushes, but the federal policy is really undermining that. And so one of the things that's interesting, I don't know what it means or what it's going to happen, but is that especially in the childcare space, one of the main objectives of SEIU is to aggregate workers into groups together, not necessarily through collective bargaining, but through other mechanisms. And like one of the things I like to do is sort of draw parallels between things that exist already and things that we think are new. And I think one of the things that Freelancers Union does and leveraged, but it's similar in part of the labor movement already, is the health and training and benefit funds that unions operate. So these are, so you could make an argument that the plumbers training program is a platform. It's a platform to, it's not technology, it's not a technological platform, but it is a platform that brings everybody together to coordinate that training. And so when they look at, you look at industries like construction, you look at industries like a lot of the trades, the main job, so something that Fredrik brought up, the main job of a lot of these folks is yes, there are architects, yes, there are engineers, yes, there are people who do this, but the main job of the employer, quote unquote, is just to win the contract and then aggregate the workers into different ways, right? And so arguably you could look at a construction, you'd look at these different kind of models and say, yeah, this is an algorithm actually could sort of solve a lot of that problem, because it's really, there's still, friction in that market. So you need businesses bidding and different things like that. But there are lots of opportunities to do that. So to my mind, the sort of what I would caution us around, and I'm sort of inclined to do this, but I would caution us around is to look and say, in the sort of where we are right now in the U.S., I don't know if sort of figuring out collective bargaining models is the right to build a political institution to leverage policy. That might be the right, it's not the only way to do it, but it's certainly sort of something we should be focusing on more of.
I think that I'll just be the moderator for a moment, and I'll say maybe it's a good time to open it up to questions. If anyone has a discussion or comment, yes. I'll here.
Hi, thank you very much. I'm someone who has like 30,000 questions, so I can ask a lot more. But my first one is, so this is my first exposure to like platform co-op in relation to unions, and it's very interesting. And so my question is, in your work, like unfortunately we're functioning in a very competitive market, right, and competitive world. So like in your work, especially with people who have been working across platforms, have you ever encountered situations where you're competing across platforms for resources, or like where you like sort of like bump up and there's tension with the real world, and like how do you resolve that or approach that, right? I think like policy is a great example, but I'm thinking about more like when you're competing for economic resources.
Anyone wish to take this? Give it to you, Dave.
So competition is hard. The sort of fortunate thing, which is unfortunate, is that it's pretty small. It's a pretty small world, so it's a whole lot easier to collaborate than it is to compete, because there's the real competition is folks outside. So we have not really run into that issue. I think where we run into that issue for us, which is sort of a not-for-profit problem, is groups that are organizing this work competing over the resources to fund the work. So that is a real challenge, and there it's really about it's this, and this is I think one of the things that we can learn from the cooperative movement. It's like one of the cooperative principles is cooperation amongst cooperatives, right? And so the where that work and the sort of like advocacy, where that work and sort of that, or the challenge of competition has been overcome, is when people put into the mindset of like there's a grow the pie mentality that we can build it up. But unfortunately, in the sort of on the job level, right, the competition isn't there. So in the city, in New York City, for instance, Up and Go, which is a platform for house cleaning cooperatives, there's some overlap in terms of geography where the markets are, but I think those groups as a group really look and say the real sort of competitors, the folks that we want to take on and challenge, are the not so nice employers, or the sort of more traditional employers.
Can I answer that a little bit from like the inside of a union's perspective? Well, I mean, if you look at this, so in Sweden at least, and the United States, it's slightly higher in percentage, but a very small portion of the labor force has worked towards these advanced digital platforms. In Sweden, it's about 2%. Most of them do it as supplemental income. Why should we internally put members' money's resources into, investigating this or trying to get collective agreements here? Because it's people who are paid not very much, not going to pay a lot of dues. But I know this question comes up everywhere. In Sweden, most of the major unions now are taking this issue seriously, even though we're not going to get thousands of members or millions in revenue for the union itself in doing this. But we see it as it's a question of survival. We have to deal with this question now, or we're going to have a much harder time dealing with it later. But I imagine that type of conflict is present in all unions. Why should we deal with this when we have to deal with right to work, a major loss of revenue that might come up? So I don't know if that answers it, but...
Hi. So I have two separate but related questions that are around sort of the market. So thinking about, there's a challenge that you're all speaking to around how do you organize the workforce side? How do you get people to band together, join a co-op, try to set the standards or agree to set the standards? And so one question I think is for Fredrik, in the space that I work in, which is primarily with home care workers who care for low-income seniors and people with disabilities, very similar to the childcare space, where you could set standards, but the people you're caring for can't afford to pay those standards. And so thinking about how do you, I don't know if there's anything in Sweden that talks about how the market responds when the community that you're trying to serve can't, it's different than maybe construction or other things where you're contracting with the business. And then my second question for the US-based groups is related to that, which is how you're handling in the online platform workforce co-op sector enforcement. So if you set standards and then people meet and take their relationship offline and undercut the standards that you're setting, if you have examples of how you're doing enforcement around that, that would be very helpful.
So that is an extremely difficult question to answer for many reasons. But of course, I'd say that a lot of the companies that we are platform companies and privately owned who we deal with, if they are to implement our agreements, they will most likely need to change some aspects of their business. And the service they are selling will probably be a bit more expensive than it was at the outset. So yes, by providing a higher floor in earnings and working conditions and pensions and so on, yes, the consumer will need to have to pay for this. Now you work in home care and services. Well, we have universal health care. We do have private businesses, but they are tax funded in this area. So, but it is really difficult. And one way we are looking at dealing with this is the platforms in Sweden are normally focused on the major city areas, so Stockholm, Malmö, and Gothenburg. One thing we're exploring is looking at, well, can we certify these platforms, showing, so the public knows you're buying a socially sustainable service. We already seen one taxi platform in Stockholm called Bzt. They have electric small taxis driving around. They when they had their big launch in Stockholm, they had a small, maybe 2 paragraphs in their press release saying, oh yeah, we have a collective agreement with the taxi workers union. And immediately it was picked up in international press. The World Economic Forum did a thing about it. So we're seeing in Sweden, where the average consumer in the large cities are quite well off, most of them, who use these services at least. We're seeing that the higher costs actually attracts more buyers. But you're speaking from a very different perspective, and I'm sorry, I don't really have a good answer. That's unless it's universal health care, but.
I think it's actually really interesting, because like I was mentioning, we were in this conference this week on home care, and something that it is very, very different also, like, and where you are located, like we were looking at some of these home care providers. They are, in places where the majority of their income is coming from Medicare, and some other is coming from private. And also, like, it was really interesting when you were doing the analysis of, like, the map of the United States, and where, old people is going, they can't afford, to be in places like the South, like New Mexico, Arizona, Florida, where it's really, really different from people that doesn't really have, the economic power to move to a place that will be more favorable for their health. And the conditions, for the workers, and probably even the wages are really different from, people that can't afford to pay more, like in some cases, for instance, here in New York, the workers of the home care cooperative, the cooperative home care associates, are mostly, like low income, work class, and the people that they are serving are, pretty similar to them. So, and I think that was like the majority was Medicare, probably. So yeah, I think the problem of, access to health as a human right in this country is, it's a challenge that we all have, you know, and also then retirement, you know, because we're not going to have money to decide what kind of care, you know, we want to have. So I don't know.
So I would just add, that you know, so in the spirit of learning from failure, I'll tell you a story about a co-op that couldn't keep people together and wound up dissolving. So Isaiah helped start a house cleaning or a commercial cleaning co-op called Win-Win in Boston, in partnership with an organization that was doing community organizing in the Vietnamese community. So it was successful. The workers had all the work they needed, and so they asked the question, why are we contributing any money to the co-op, right? Like, we're done. Like, I'm full, right? Like, so David, the cleaner who cleans our offices still, right, as David's cleaning, not Win-Win anymore, because Win-Win died. You know, he was like, I don't need any more business. So why do I continue to, operate within the co-op? I'm going to separate out from this, right? And that happened enough that the co-op fell apart. So on the one hand, like, the co-op was a failure. On the other hand, like, these workers, they had, enough work to sustain themselves. So that was, good. But for me, one of the key lessons of that is we have to continually figure out how to provide something of value in the marketplace. That if we are not constantly providing something of value, if we're not constantly meeting the members' needs and addressing like their new needs, like so a members' needs or workers' needs today might be I need access to a job, and they're at, but once they get a job, well, why do I can step away. Can I get, what is the next need that they might do, which might be more hours, it might be insurance, it might be, training, it might be some other mechanism. So I think we need to constantly be thinking about building systems that are meaningful, that provide meaningful value to the members, or else they will disappear, right? And if you look at the agricultural cooperatives, like they take this huge piece out of the farmers' hands, which is like how to deal with the shitstorm that is the market, right? Like they know how to raise cows and how to do this thing, and so they have a constant need to be having somebody help sort of be an intermediary for them in the market, and so there's a constant need. You've got co-ops that have been successful for a very, very long time. I think we need to make sure that these platforms are not sort of not defeating, but like that have a constant purpose, or just acknowledge that sometimes the co-op only should exist for a period of time. It solves a problem, then it disappears, and that might be okay too.
Okay, so with commercial enterprises in the stock market, studies have shown that only 30% of the value of market cap is actually related to real assets, and 70% is this nebulous concept called brand. Is there anything like that you've seen in the work that you're doing about a way to value all of the other benefits that aren't revenue?
Well, if I could pertain to what I said earlier about us creating a certification scheme and the fact that privately owned platform companies, venture capital funded platform companies come to us, is that they see having a relationship with the major trade unions in Sweden is incredibly valuable for their startup business. It lends them legitimacy. It lends them an air of being a socially responsible company. So in that way, we are providing in that way somehow, I guess. And I mean, the SEIU negotiations that didn't go through with Airbnb about cleaners being under collective agreement, I think, for Airbnb's, the cleaning services connected to the platform. I'm quite sure that was also an attempt for them to strengthen their brand name and their social consciousness.
Hello. So my name is Ism. I'm an organizer with the Writers Guild of America East. We've been a trade union for 7 years. We recently we're working on the DNA Info Gothamist reporters and content creators who were just all laid off by their billionaire employer. So we are very interested in this conversation for a variety of reasons. So I guess the just like straight up concrete questions that I have is, do you know of any digital media platforms or businesses that are run cooperatively owned, employee owned, community owned, city fund? Like what is the lay of the land for different non-billionaire or non-private ownership of the means of production? And then two, what is the concrete relationship of trade unions to some of these things? We're trying to figure out what our role in that is. Are we the co-owners? Are we financial sponsors? Are we helping them just facilitate their own self-activity to buy the thing, and then we just add support? So trying to think through concretely what is the trade union's role in worker cooperatives. Thank you.
So I can speak to the second part. One of the, and this is a so I am not an attorney, so I'm going to talk about the law, but this is not a legal opinion because I'm not an attorney. One of the real challenges that unions face in the U.S. is that unions are not allowed to accept things of value from employers in industries that they represent workers. So what does that mean? Well, it means very explicitly, like, you're not allowed to accept kickbacks, right? That's like ostensibly why the law was written. But what it could potentially mean is it could mean that if a union invests within or has an ownership stake within a company that it represents the workers, and it were to get a return on that investment in any way, that would be illegal. Right? So the relationship, the legal relationship between unions and these businesses is very difficult to navigate. People will, maybe thinking like, well, no, I know an example of, the unions doing this. And there are lots of examples out there where unions are doing very interesting, clever things. Almost all of those things have not been challenged in the courts. And if you're not aware of the court system in the United States, like, pretty much it hates workers, and it hates unions more than it hates workers. So it's a really challenging thing to do. So navigating that is really tricky. The way that the way that a lot of unions deal with that is either kind of sort of just operating under the radar, with the associated risks that brings. The other way they deal with that is by working in partnership with other organizations, right? So in a lot of like in situations like with Gothamus and DNA Info, ICA has been engaged to sort of advocate as a sort of an investment banker or as a new buyer for this company, and the union is paying us. And so, but ostensibly, we're creating a business that is not controlled by the union, although it's explicit that there's going to be that collective bargaining relationship, and that labor piece is going to continue on in there. But there's some really sort of stupid, tricky legal things around the ownership side, and you have to be just navigating that is a real challenge. But it's not like logical or good law. It's just the law we have. So.
First of all, I want to thank the panel. It's been a very interesting and engaging conversation. There's a a not so quiet development in industry called the blockchain, which is decentralizing everything. And one of the things I'm concerned about is, of course, how this impacts labor. It's like we're heading back to the Wild West, and so I'm curious as to what the panel might think about that.
It all depends how we practically could use the blockchain for ourselves in the future. I would say that in my union, I'd say very few unions are actually looking at blockchain solutions to. I mean, we have a lot of databases over members and so on. In Sweden, that information is super sensitive, protected by the Constitution and Freedom Association Acts and everything. But I mean, it all depends on what kind of blockchain. I have a lot of arguments with my friends about this. He's super optimistic about blockchains, and I'm an economist. I'm like, it has tulip warning written all over it. But it all depends on what the systems are there to do, right? And I mean, the future success of blockchains depends on what type of practical problems they are set up to build. And I'm sure that we could use blockchain technology if it helps us solve, I mean, it doesn't sound very exciting, but maybe administrative purposes would be easier to solve through blockchain technology. But practically working at a union, I don't see any business solutions built around that technology right now that are practically useful for us.
There was a question right here. Oh, yeah, sorry.
You're the moderator.
Thank you, and thank the panel for this interesting discussion. I just wanted to briefly pick up on this notion of branding and Airbnb's attempt to cut a deal with the SCIU in the US. Previously, I'm from Canada, and right now Airbnb is trying to enter an organizing agreement with the largest Canadian private sector union, Unifor. So I just wanted to get your opinion on what you think workers can get out of any of such an agreement, if anything. Given that we are talking about Airbnb, which, I don't have to explain myself.
Do you know much about the SCIU?
So I think a lot of it comes to like where, like the perspective where you're sitting from. So, and this notion of, I think Airbnb in particular, it's like, are they so awful and like reprehensible that we can never engage with them? Or are they a mechanism to create, hundreds, if not, tens of thousands of high quality cleaning jobs, right? So I'm confident that Airbnb was looking to not be Uber, right? And to build, they had been, were being, really attacked publicly for the impact they were having on gentrification in San Francisco, right? And which is real and measurable and, significant and bad. And so a lot of the response to that was like, let's buy some labor peace, right? And let's engage with, cleaning businesses around the U.S. that are organized and internationally as well. And I think some of the real questions like I would use to look at it is like somewhat practical of like, can you, is Airbnb going to go away, right? Because if they're not going to go away, right, like it's like if you look at this and say we can get this really great deal with Ford, or we can protect the saddle market, right? Like in the 30s, like if like betting on the saddle market's not where we should be going. So if Airbnb and its ilk are going to be around forever and ever and ever, then there's an argument to be made that cleaning should be done by unionized, cooperatively owned, socially responsible businesses. At the same time, if they're killing the hotel workers, working conditions, and they're making the communities in which workers live, increasingly unaffordable because of gentrification, and just accelerating that, it's like we have to figure out how to solve both of those problems. What I tend not to do is put the blame on the person who's sort of solving a problem for their constituency that they're dealing with right now, right? Like people make these decisions based upon where they're at right now. So that's like that's not an answer. It's just like a response. But I don't know. Other folks.
Oh, yeah.
Hi. I had a question that's partly theoretical, but also I think very concrete in terms of impact on workers. In in thinking about the ownership of platforms and the value they provide, and also the financial value. So, and then touching on questions of centralization versus decentralization, or aggregation, intermediation versus disintermediation. So I think, platforms can provide, they definitely provide a value in terms of exchange, matchmaking, and I'm wondering if you have thoughts or examples, maybe even in your own work, of in the creation of platforms, thinking about them either connecting participants to resources versus being an opportunity for workers to own the platform themselves and benefit from the platform financially. So one example, like in the case of freelancers, might be, is it an employment platform that connects workers to jobs, or is it a platform that actually maybe employs the workers and gives them benefits and maybe is owned by the workers? Like how you go about thinking about structure and ownership and financial value with platforms.
I guess I'll answer sort of what's guided what we've built, which is really, starting from sitting in our members' shoes and thinking about their immediate needs, and the platform's success resting on the fact that there has to be a tangible immediate value from coming together for these workers, right? And we have a culture within our membership of which there is a structural alignment and a desire for cooperation due to frankly the nature of the work that they're doing and the types of resources they need. And so, what we've really looked towards doing is not thinking as much about democratic ownership, but thinking about other worker-guided processes. So how can we be building in structures in which leaders are oriented around specific programs and specific areas of expertise, where they're being given a platform and a geography to start organizing around those needs, and how that can have a really fruitful exchange between our institution, which has to survive over the long-term horizon, and their ability to move in and out of these platforms as they so choose, right? Because there has to be that sort of interplay. There's people that are going to come to our platform for training, for access to benefits, for, depending on what's happening in their very fluid work lives, and they need to be able to enter, they need to be able to have a say that's really oriented around their level of contribution, right? So when you join, it's free to join, it's an easy open door. That your say should really depend on how much you're actively contributing to that platform. And you should be able to leave as your circumstances change, as it very frequently does. So I hope that wasn't too abstract, but that's sort of like what's guided how we've oriented our community organizing, our political work, even our benefits.
I was talking with some folks in Pittsburgh. They are a conversion. They're really interesting model that they're having on their governance. But it's basically a platform. They're called Work Hard Pittsburgh. And it's a platform for freelancers, and something that I found that was interesting, like the whole ownership, I think is still is going to be in transition until they complete their conversion to a cooperative. But what I found that was interesting and the interaction that they are proposing to the workers is that what we call in cooperatives the initial investment capital, the contribution, the initial capital. They require that as a monthly membership, but then also to become a member, so like the path to membership. They require to members to offer, I think, something like 60 hours of community work. So it can be an exchange of your services to another member. So for instance, if you're a web designer, you support with like 60 hours to another member. It can be, to build their website or something. And then, or it can be to the platform itself, or it can be to the community where they are based in Pittsburgh through a nonprofit. So that I found it was interesting, like how you're actually, using the platform, but then also like supporting in, like the the membership and the community. And another thing that was interesting was like, this is a platform that is based in Pittsburgh, and I think they are trying to just to stay there. Another question to me, like, is like, when we're talking about online platforms, like, for me, we need to think also across the borders. We have specific conditions in the States, and countries, but like, these platforms are also models. They are, crossing the borders. So I don't know, what that means to unions.
Any final comments from the panel? Okay. Well, thank you everyone for coming. This has been fun.